My name is Alastair King-Smith, and I'm delighted to be here to introduce Baroness Shami Chakrabarti, a distinguished member of the British House of Lords, one of our most prominent British lawyers and human rights activists, very well connected with the Labour movement and indeed with current British political dynamics. Shami, you were previously Shadow Attorney General, the most senior lawyer in the opposition leadership at the time. And we're very lucky to have you here in Albania before you fly back to the UK for the Labour Party conference tomorrow. And of course, you are a very well sought after speaker and author. And since leaving Albania 6 weeks ago, I've had the privilege, after 3 years here, to read your fantastic book, Human Rights, The Case for the Defence. And I particularly want to thank those who've organised this festival for bringing us together, to Lair, to Joanne, for giving me the chance to come back, and for inspiring you to come to Albania. And our focus in this session, under the overall title of Freedom and Transformation, is, of course, human rights. So we're going to approach this through a number of frames. First, your personal inspiration. Secondly, the broad dynamics around human rights globally. And then thirdly, perhaps some of the ways that human rights are playing out in Albania. And of course, fourthly, however our wonderful audience and participants wish to take the discussion. So Shami, to start with your inspiration, what inspired you to champion human rights as your life's mission?
Well, thank you, Alastair, and thanks again to the hosts of this wonderful new festival. I've had the privilege to visit lots of book festivals and cultural festivals and literature festivals in recent decades, and this new one is already one of my favourites. So huge congratulations to you all. I hope it prospers. I hope there's another one next year and the year after, and it becomes an important fixture here in Albania, and also in relation to to our shared dialogue. Why did I get involved in human rights? Looking back at this stage in my life, the age of 55, how did that happen? Now, with that kind of hindsight, I think it was almost inevitable. I think with my personal and family story, it was almost inevitable. So we're talking about cultural blending. Certainly in the first session, we were talking with Noel Malcolm. Oh, I loved that, by the way. Leah Upi interviewing the two Noel Malcolms. Did you love that? The two Noel Malcolms. I was thinking maybe there are two Noel Gallaghers too. The other one might be self-deprecating like Noel Malcolm. You see, the English people laugh at that. I think that cultural blending. My parents came to London from India in the late 1950s, and they obviously experienced a great deal of racism, and that was part of my family story. Coming as non-white people from the Commonwealth to London, they experienced real racism. My parents were beaten up by skinheads on Hampstead Heath, a beautiful part of London, as they walked me in the pram in early 1970. And this wasn't something that they dwelt on, but it was something that was there. You can't help it. When you have been othered, when you have been treated that way, when your parents have, when it's part of your story, it is there. At the same time, however, I want to be positive. They came to London from Kolkata as young idealists. They came in their 20s. They thought of London as something not alien. They thought of it as going home to the centre of the Commonwealth. They really respected their idea of the British rule of law. So, I'm sure that's partly why I became a lawyer, because my parents, neither of them came from legal families, but they respected institutions and the rule of law. In the second wonderful session, Olivia Suchik was talking about the vultures who came to Cambridge to recruit young arts graduates from Cambridge into the law, a different kind of law. Just saying, not guilty. Not guilty of making lots of money in the city out of law. But I think that is partly what drove me into this idea. So law was about respect for the British rule of law values. Human rights was about understanding there's another side as well. And wanting the law first, and then later human rights, not just as law, but as values, to be something that can protect the vulnerable against abuses by the powerful, but also something that can help us all better understand each other.
And Shami, so you're a human rights champion, and clearly that personal inspiration is there. You're now a member of the British House of Lords, this rather bizarre for the non-British second chamber in Parliament.
It's pretty bizarre for some of us in Britain too, to be fair.
So what's it like being a human rights champion in the House of Lords, and particularly at a time of transition in British politics?
Well, it's an adventure. It's bizarre. It's all of these things. It's a strange thing. The British Second Chamber, the House of Lords, is a very strange thing that is very difficult to explain, let alone justify, to any democratic person anywhere in the world. How can you justify a legislative chamber where unelected people sit? Some people are sitting there because of who their father and grandfather and whatever. And of course the hereditaries are all male, has to be said. Some people are sitting there, a few people are sitting there because they're bishops and they're part of the established church. And the rest of us are sitting there because we were appointed by prime ministers and by prime ministers. And it's a very, very odd thing to explain, let alone justify. And when I was a young law student at the LSE, the London School of Economics, another connection with Leah, we also share a publisher, I can remember at the age of 19, studying constitutional law and being asked in exam questions, can you justify the House of Lords? And you'd think this is going to be a short essay, isn't it? You could say no, or you could go American and say hell no. That's two words instead of one. So, but what I would say is that it's a strength and a weakness in the UK that we've been a relatively unbroken democracy for a very long time. So it's been a long time since occupation, revolution, whatever. And so the constitution of the UK has evolved rather than revolved. And that means we don't have a properly written down constitution, we don't have proper separation of powers, we don't have an entrenched Bill of Rights, or a constitutional court or Supreme Court in the American or French or whatever sense. But what we do have is this, so even people in the highest court, which is now called a Supreme Court, they can find against the government of the day and say this decision is unlawful, and the government can just go, so what? You're unelected judges, we don't care, which is pretty much what happened with over the Rwanda policy, by the way, under the last government. And then you have this weird second chamber that I sit in of unelected people, and they provide sometimes a little bit of ballast against very powerful elected governments with huge majorities. Now, I'm not saying that this is the perfect system of government. What I am suggesting is if we are going to if we're going to have proper constitutional reform in the UK, it may be time to say, don't do it piecemeal. If you're going to get rid of these unelected people in the second chamber, you might need to give a little bit more clout to the independent judiciary in the Supreme Court.
Fascinating. Now, one big question I had in my mind was, why did you decide to write about human rights now?
So, well, as you've heard from Olivia and other, you know, these books take a few years, and I was moved to write that book at a time when I was feeling pretty depressed about the discussion around rights and freedoms in the UK. As if people in the UK had begun to take their rights and freedoms for granted. So much so that in large parts of the political conversation, human rights had become a dirty word. You described me very generously as an activist and as a lawyer, but the term activist lawyer was being used by some politicians as literally a term of abuse a few years ago, and even more recently in the UK. When we had our troubles, I was so interested in Leah and Noel talking about different institutions and different countries lecturing each other on enlightened, we won't call them European values, we call them human rights values, call them enlightened values, whatever you want to call them, but everybody wants to lecture everybody else. After what happened in England and Northern Ireland this summer, I'm not going to lecture anybody about what can go right and wrong in a country with embedded institutions, with long-term democracy, you know, democracy, human rights, so fragile. Civilization itself, so fragile. And we have had lawyers have death threats because they represent some of the most vulnerable people on the planet, asylum seekers and refugees. And we've had people, forget the debate about the European Union, I'm talking about the Council of Europe and the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a very precious thing, a reflection of truly international, universal values that were enshrined after World War II, and not just on the continent where the two world wars began, but shared by people from all over the globe, different religions, east, west, north, south. A spectacular moment in human achievement, I think. You know, Eleanor Roosevelt and all that. And we were seeing these values being trashed in the United Kingdom by mainstream politicians. And I thought, the problem is people don't know what they've got to lose. And because we don't have a written constitution and an entrenched Bill of Rights, most people in the UK, even teachers and doctors and journalists and politicians themselves, don't actually know what human rights are, where they came from, what they're not, and that's why I wrote the book.
Well, the foreword to the book is by Tom Bingham, former Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, and you were talking about the important and evolving role of judges. Why did you choose Tom Bingham? What was the inspiration for that and the connection?
So Tom Bingham is, I think, perhaps the greatest British jurist, certainly the greatest British judge. And certainly of my lifetime. He's been dead some years, but in a previous job, I was the director of a human rights organisation called Liberty, the National Council for Civil Liberties in the UK. And I ran that organisation, and some years ago we had an annual conference, and Tom, I think, had recently retired from the Supreme Court, and he was very keen that in his retirement, you know, he could no longer, they had an absolute retirement age, he could no longer sit in the judiciary, and I think in those days, and I mean now they go and they make people go and make money and they go into the city and they become arbitrators and whatever, but it wasn't so much like it then. He was very keen that he wanted to speak to non-lawyers about the law and about human rights. And he very kindly came to speak to the gathering. And he wrote a speech for that Liberty annual conference. And the words that I use as the epigraph to the book are from that speech that he wrote specially for us. And if you have it there, the words are, what he had done earlier in the speech is he set out free speech, fair trials, personal privacy, family life, non-discrimination. And then he ended with the words, there may be some who would like to live in a country where these rights are not respected, but I am not of their number. And I thought, I have to put that. And unfortunately, Tom did not get the chance to go on and speak to many more non-legal audiences, because pretty soon after retirement, he was suddenly diagnosed with cancer and he died very quickly. But I think it's very important that those words live on.
Well, I agree, and I think the other thing you emphasise in the book is the privilege of being able to choose one's country, which was something that previously was not the case. Now, the first half of the book is actually an excellent primer or refresh on the international and regional human rights frameworks. And I think your thesis, which I certainly share, is that these remain relevant, applicable to today's challenges. And I found it particularly useful, you were saying about others need to remember about human rights, and definitely as a diplomat, we have to apply human rights frameworks. But there were some parts of that I hadn't remembered, and it was really helpful, so thank you for those. But if there was one aspect of the international human rights framework that you would change now, what would it be?
I don't think I would change, but there's some building that needs to be done. You know, even human rights treaties are drafted by humans, so they're not, nothing that humans draft is perfect or perfect forever. I don't think there's anything there that I think shouldn't be there in particular, but there are now gaps because of the challenges that we face in the 21st century and the challenges we are likely to continue facing. I think in the book I talk about new technology and about climate in particular. I think that, and this was why it was fascinating to listen to Olivia. I think Olivia maybe, yeah. One of the, so much I got out of the session just before. You know, she's writing because of the challenges of the internet and new technology, and that those present enormous challenges for rights and freedoms as well. And I deal with these in my chapter 5, which I call Modern Prometheus, for obvious reasons to a Cambridge literature graduate. You'll know that's the subtitle of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So I think of the internet as yet a wonderful, wonderful work of human genius, but I think of it almost like a new continent where a lot of us are spending a lot of our time. But it is not a continent that is yet properly subject to the rule of law, let alone to democratic governance. And there are a lot of human rights abuses that are now taking place in this online world. And I think I would like to see a treaty. I would like to, and because it's, you can't really regulate the internet or social media or so on comprehensively or properly in one country. I think we may need to see an internet treaty at some point in the near future. And clearly with climate, we're already taking some embryonic steps in that direction. But for example, the Refugee Convention, which I talk about in the book, you know, which has been so challenged by nationalism and divide and rule politics and the demonization of other humans. Even the Refugee Convention, which I champion and I think is very precious, is not enough to take care of what we're already calling climate refugees. So in the future, in the not too distant future, I fear there are people in island nations and low-lying nations who, even if we work faster and faster on tackling climate change, there are people whose habitats are going to be unlivable in, and they need protection and they need rights and they need safe places to go. And we may need new treaties because they don't currently sit very comfortably in the Refugee Convention definition of a refugee, because they're not being persecuted for those convention reasons, for reasons of race, religion, politics, and so on.
And that's a really interesting reflection. I think we might all take away your image of the internet and online space as another continent, because I think that is a very helpful
and you know, like other continents in the past, it's being monetized by these great big
exactly.
You know, the corporations are like the new empires. And
now, we were talking earlier as well, and we got a bit from Noel and Leia's session about some of the challenges around the relevance of international frameworks. And Shami, I sense that you're a strong advocate for internationalism, and that shines through in the book. And so how do you respond to the critics of internationalism?
Again, I was thinking about this in the first session. So I'm not against nation state. I very much, but if you believe in humans, you don't rail against aspects of their multiple identity. You know, human rights are supposed to celebrate and protect everything that a human is. And a human is a precious individual creature, but also a social creature. And so they live in families, communities, and even in nation states with their wonderful patriotic traditions and cultures and languages and so on. That's not the same as the kind of xenophobic nationalism that we sometimes see. And I'm only talking about England, right? I'm only talking about what we've seen, I'm afraid, in England over the summer. One of the challenges, I think, is that internationalism, certainly in the post-war period, when people were learning from two catastrophic global conflicts, was that we can enshrine certain values that we think of as universal. We all want free speech, fair trials, a bit of shelter and food and respect and dignity is the word we use to sum it all up. It's as if in the 21st century, those international stroke universal values are being degraded by some people, but goodness me, these people pretend to be rampant nationalists, but there's no nationalism on the Learjet and in the global corporation. That's okay for internationalism, isn't it? There's no passport control in the first class lounge and the Learjet. You know, these big men are the new empires, and they are bigger and richer than countries, and they are not currently, by the way, subject to human rights treaties. Countries are subject to human rights treaties, but not the big corporations who own tech and pharmaceuticals and so on. So that is both a challenge for human rights, but it's also a challenge for all of us and for democracy when these same players start dividing us in order to enrich themselves.
So I want to delve into that in a moment, but you also raise the other challenging set of issues that we're often facing, and in your chapter on burning injustices, you reference the enemy within and talk about some of the dimensions in various parts of the book around racism, and obviously we're thinking about that in the context at the moment also on anti-Semitism. We're in Albania, which has a very rich and impressive history of protecting Jews in the Second World War, so it's a positive example of standing up for people's rights in the face of aggression. But of course, across Europe and the world, we do see the rise of the far right, of protests becoming more prominent in politics and in society, and that's coming with real challenges for extremism, for xenophobia, for racism. And I'm just going to read what you say in that chapter, and where you talk about if sledgehammers are used to crack walnuts of protest and not reserved for extreme disorder, the politicisation of policing and the courts risks bringing law itself into disrepute. And this would be as bad for democracy as any hope of an orderly, just transition to sustainability. So the principles of proportionality and non-discrimination must inspire our policing as much as our law, and those principles still leave plenty of scope for legitimate democratic differences and political policy debate. But of course, in Britain, we've seen this come into sharp contrast, most recently with the protests and attacks across towns around the UK, particularly against those with a different heritage or against migrants, seemingly as an organised challenge to the new Labour government. So, I mean, you've conducted inquiries into anti-Semitism and racism in the Labour Party and elsewhere. How come human rights principles have not put an end to such racist, anti-Jewish hatred and sentiment?
I think it would be naive to suggest that human rights principles would ever put an end to some of the worst instincts in human nature. You know, they celebrate some of the best aspirations, and they are there in part as a safeguard, but they're not going to put an end to man's inhumanity to man. They ought to inspire us, and in some cases regulate us. They can inspire our policy and our ethical behaviour as much as our law. Now, in the context of protest, which is the example you gave, I do believe that people must have a right to protest, and they have to have a right to protest when they disagree with me and when they agree with me. Again, in the first session, Brexit was referenced. I have seen in the UK, in the last decade, very, very well-attended protests both for and against Brexit. As a politician, I have been shouted at by one side or the other, and I accept that, because that is part... Democracy isn't just about voting every few years. Democracy is about people being able to speak freely and to assemble, including on the street. But that is not the same as picking up bricks and attacking refugees in hotels or the police, or black and brown people, or whatever. And that's why the principle of proportionality, which we all understand, is such an important human rights principle, and it's a principle that should guide policing responses. And what was happening in recent years is some people in the previous government, I am going to say this, treated protests they didn't like as illegitimate, and protests that they liked as legitimate. And that's why the principle of equal treatment or non-discrimination becomes so important. So in previous years, we had them call environmental protesters eco-warriors. They were talking about the cause rather than the behaviour. So when you're policing protests, you don't police the protest on the basis of whether you agree with the person protesting. You police the protest on the basis of, are they harming other people? Are they creating a danger? It's not that difficult. The key to the kingdom of trying to apply your human rights values is equal treatment or non-discrimination. Treating other people as you would like to be treated yourself, whether you agree with them or not. And that is, we throw these words about like hard left, far right, even in vigorous democracies, but the real test for me is whether you believe in the rule of law, democratic institutions, rights and freedoms, and whether you will operate these principles with an even hand. Treat your opponents as you would like to be treated. Treat people that you really disagree with as you would like to be treated. That's the key to the human rights kingdom, I think.
Now let's turn to some of the human rights challenges and how they impact in Albania, not just here, but certainly here too. You've of course emphasised you're not an expert in Albania, on Albania, so we promise to take your comments without expecting you to know the detail or get involved in the internal issues here. But I'd like to just bring to light and get your perspective on how some of those global challenges are affecting many Albanians. We're seeing how fast Albania is developing. But for countries like Albania, sometimes the principles of human rights or environmental protection, the climate issues you mentioned, often seem to be constraints on that need for development rather than an enabler, a sort of luxury that you can't really afford until later on. So how do you feel Albania and Albanians should balance that need for development with human rights?
So I don't even see it as a balance. I think if you are if you're in a state of new and rapid development now, at this moment, a quarter of the way into the 21st century, you have this great opportunity to develop in a certain way. So if, for example, you choose to develop in certain ways, in new technologies that are going to be good for sustainability and good for the climate, and choose to make yourself a centre of that kind of technology and development, you are not only doing something good for the planet, you're putting your country and your economy at the cutting edge of the world economy, for example. And you could say the same about, in the context of the, we talked about the internet and social media. If you chose to if you chose to invest, for example, in institutes of studying not just AI, but AI and ethics, or chose to experiment with the regulation of social media, and tried to set gold standards for how this could be done elsewhere in Europe and around the world. You are developing, you're encouraging investment, but you're doing it in a way that is sustainable, that is innovative, that is actually a blend between culture, science, and economic development.
Now, the last issue I wanted to ask you before opening up to the audience is about media freedom. In chapter 4, on when you talk about when rights clash, you highlight the interplay between privacy and expression, about traditional media and social media, the challenges around freedom of speech and expression online. You were a panel member of the Leveson inquiry into press freedom in the UK, so I think you are really well placed to sort of articulate the tensions between freedom and regulation. And I just want to pull out a comment you make in the book in here. And you say, it's important to remember that this kind of dispute is not just about the lucrative game of cat and mouse between media empires and wealthy celebrities. In an age of mobile devices and social media platforms, the principles can just as easily be engaged by arguments between private individuals with each other. However, unlike the owners of tabloids and tiaras, they may lack the means to have these properly and fairly resolved. Now, in Albania, there's a particular challenge around the control by media and TV owners or their political mentors of what news or scandals get reported. And of course, as you were highlighting, small countries and individuals in places like Albania find it really difficult to find a way to interact with the rich, huge social media companies. So how should Albanians navigate these challenges?
It's not particular to Albania. I mean, we all have our particularisms, but the challenges now, the tensions between free speech on the one hand and incitement to rape and violence, and this issue about the post-truth world that some people want to build, that's a challenge everywhere. And it has made me really reflect as a human rights lawyer. My mind is changing and evolving the whole time, even in areas that I've studied my whole working life. I've always been really quite libertarian about free speech, and thought even when there are there've always been newspapers in Britain that have been notorious for their very explicit politics, which might not be my politics, and we say, well, it doesn't matter because people can. It's just one newspaper. It's just like writing a pamphlet. It should be pretty much unlimited, subject to very, very broad limits. But when you combine that with the new technology and the ability to drag people into a rabbit hole where they're not going to see other influences, it's a new complex challenge. And algorithms that bring vulnerable people into particular places on this new continent, there is, I think, a greater justification for regulation in a way that there never would have been a justification for regulating the printing press or the pamphlet. in the same way. So I think that's not just a challenge for Albania. And remember, after the war, you know, even in Britain, with its great tradition of a free press, there was regulation around TV and radio because you had these new technologies that would go right into your home, and frankly, only a few people owned them. So you couldn't treat a TV company after World War II in the same way that you could treat the written word, because the written word, at least technically, was something that everybody could access. That was not the case with TV and radio, and so there was some regulation. It's not everybody can own a platform like what, you know, the one formerly known as Twitter or anything else for that matter. There is, I think, a justification for a greater degree of regulation in these pervasive new technologies than, for example, about what you say on the street or even on this stage or what you write in a pamphlet.
Fascinating. Well, let's open this up then to questions. Please do put your hands up. Roving mics coming round. We'll start with Olivia over there. I can see Vasilika here. And do say your name if I don't know it, so we'll bring you in.
Thank
Olivia,
you
please.
so much. That's so interesting. I could ask a lot about algorithms, but I wanted to talk about, you were talking about the, in the UK context, the idea that our previous government favoured some protests over others, which I agreed with. And I'm wondering, on an international sort of scale, what you make right now of what many see as the erosion of faith in international humanitarian law when it comes to double standards with, for example, Palestine and Gaza.
And over here, Vasilika, lady here. And then we'll go to the person who's behind.
Thank you very much for speaking, especially about racism. I'm very happy. This is the second time I'm very happy today because first we talked about a bit of homophobia, now about racism, very important topics in Albania, but also in this city. The organization Sea-Watch, who is a migrants advocacy group, called the recently or the upcoming migrant center that is going to be established in the north of Albania. It's an agreement between Italy and Albania as a legal or as a reminiscent of penal colonies, and that will put migrants in a legal limbo. What is your opinion on that? Thank you.
And then just behind, there's another question. And would you mention your name, please?
My name is Rudina Yassini. I am a great admirer of your work and your stance on human rights. A question that I have relates actually more in the context of international rule-based order, and especially with regard to the conflict in Gaza. We know that legal, institutional, and moral appeals make up for what we call the international rule-based order. When we look at the context of the decision made by the ICJ, currently the perception out there is that we are almost at a breaking point, and I want to know what your opinion is in this regard. Do you believe that currently, as we stand, the international community is facing almost a breaking point with regards to respect to international rule-based order? Thank you.
Thank you. So, of course, the first and third questions are the same question, so I will... so, which one is the easy one? Okay. So why don't we do the migration question and treat that as the easy one? To be clear, I don't know the detail of the treaty, of the arrangement between Italy and Albania. I have the headlines, but I don't know the details, so I should be cautious. But what I do know about, what I did know about, which is no more, mercifully, was the Rwanda scheme. So you can take by analogy anything I say about that you think may or may not be relevant. I remember, for me, I started as a lawyer, and then, but human rights for me are not just about the law. They're not just about international binding treaties, including the Refugee Convention, including other treaties. They are also about informing our ethics, our morals, our politics, our policy. I am very, very instinctively uncomfortable, maybe because of the life story that you've heard, maybe because I am the child of migrants. I'm very instinctively uncomfortable about the idea that forget the law, forget whether I'm saying a particular scheme is or is not compatible with law, subject to the detail, just ethically, morally, I am instinctively uncomfortable about the idea of wealthier countries contracting with slightly less wealthy countries for the offloading or offshoring of their responsibilities, whether for refugees and asylum seekers, whether for their own prisoners, has been suggested even in the UK, even in recent weeks. I was reading stories about we've got overcrowded prisons, so maybe we could send some prisoners to another country. I am not comfortable with human freight. And that is just my personal instinct. That's not to say that there aren't some schemes for responsibility sharing between friendly nations who share a peninsula or share within the European Union. We had the Dublin Convention. It didn't always work that well, but it was this idea that we all have a responsibility as an international community when there is a war somewhere, when there are lots of refugees or whatever, and we should all take a portion of vulnerable people. You know, that's a different, potentially a very distinct issue. But the idea that I am wealthy, I will pay for you to take my human freight I will dump my toxic waste. It's not something I'm instinctively comfortable. But you have to look at the detail. I mean, you have to look at the detail of the scheme, and I don't know the detail of the Albanian Italy scheme, but I knew the Rwanda scheme, and it was sickening and it was unlawful, and I'm glad that our Supreme Court found it so. And then the first two questions, and this is about, really I talked about the people who are cynical, sceptical about the international rules-based order, maybe from the right, the far right of politics, or from the xenophobic, nationalist end of politics. But you're right that one of the reasons I wrote the book was that there are a lot of idealistic people, including on the centre-left, who have become cynical, disappointed in the international rules-based order because they don't see it living up to its promise. And in particular, it's around this idea of double standards. And I, in the context of war and peace, there's a chapter in the book, chapter 6 in the book is called War and Peace. I think that the UN structures were drafted at that moment in time. The Security Council were the permanent members of the Security Council were the winners of World War II, frozen in time. And now we've got this challenge where, you have members of you have some permanent members of the Security Council who are just as capable of being a threat to security as a benign police officer. The Russian Federation is an obvious example. Okay. And it may be that those structures need to evolve in time. In the meantime, there has been some creativity. Even recently, you see much more at the UN General Assembly with motions being passed in areas that perhaps traditionally, more generally, are seen as the preserve of the Security Council, because you've got global majority people saying, hang on a minute, if this part of the institution is not going to do its job, this part of the institution, which arguably has more democratic legitimacy, representing many more people globally, is going to try and step up. And we've seen these innovations at, for example, the ICJ in the court system. But ultimately, law is not enough by itself. There aren't enough judges on the planet, and they do not carry weapons to achieve peace, security, and respect for human rights, which is why we do need protest, and we do need politics, and why human rights values have to live and breathe in these areas too. And I would say to young people in particular who are feeling cynical and let down and they see double standards, you know, you are part of the change that needs to happen. And every time you are brave and you protest or you write something or you say something, you're part of that too. And you're not alone. And I've always found in my life, when I felt cynical, depressed, disappointed, anxious, as Olivia was saying, that the antidote to that cynicism, depression, anxiety is a magic word, which I will share with you. And the magic word is solidarity. And why is this word magic? It's magic because it translates into most languages on the planet. You know, in Ubuntu, it's Ummah. In Christianity, it's fellowship. In feminism, it's sisterhood. This idea that we are bigger than me, and that when you feel something very deeply, you're probably not alone. And so, yes, there have been enormous challenges and hypocrisies, and you know, the key to the human rights kingdom is equal treatment. The opposite of that is hypocrisy, as you rightly say. But I think we're at a pivotal moment, and there are opportunities as well as challenges.
So I'm sure there are lots more questions and issues that we can cover, but we're being asked to wrap up. But what a tour d'horizon. You've taken us from water peace across continents, from media freedom to artificial intelligence. And Shami, I think you have a brilliant way of simplifying complex concepts into easy to grasp images and ideas. And I think we'll all take away your images of the internet as another continent, how countries should not dump their toxic human waste elsewhere, and what you've just finished on, the magic word, solidarity. And most importantly, if any of you wish to buy Shami's excellent book or give it to someone as a gift, I'd recommend it. Available on Amazon or in the best bookshops. But here in Albania, we're of course also lucky to be in a country with excellent and exceptional hospitality and food. And today I think we all agree you've given us all some very rich food for thought. So thank you very much.